Welcome everyone, and thank you for joining today's webinar, Inter-American Coalition for Regulatory Convergence, Virtual Training GRPs, and TBT Part 1 of 3. My name is Kim Pittenger with AdvaMed, and I will be today's webinar facilitator along with a handful of other AdvaMed staff. Before we get started, I'd like to announce some housekeeping items. Each participant is in listen-only mode, meaning that your line is currently muted. There will be a Q&A session during the presentation. Please type your questions in the questions/chat function within your GoToWebinar control panel on the right-hand side of your screen. Please also note that this presentation is being recorded. Many webinar platforms have experienced an influx of use in recent months, so should you experience any technical difficulties during the webinar, first attempt to exit the broadcast and rejoin. There is a link to a general troubleshooting guide in the chat box as well. If any of the panelists experience audio or technical difficulties, please let us know using the chat function. Today's webinar recording and materials will be available to attendees within 24 hours of the conclusion of the broadcast at www.interamericancoalition-medtech.org. This concludes the housekeeping portion of our webinar. It is my pleasure to turn it over to Sandra Gonzalez to get us started.
Thank you, Kim. Good morning, everyone. Wish you and your beloved ones are healthy, and welcome to the first of our series of 4 webinars on policy, good regulatory practices, and technical barriers to trade. My name is Sandra Gonzalez, and I am honored to have been appointed as Executive Secretary for the Inter-American Coalition for Regulatory Convergence in the Medical Technology sector. During today's session, presenters will be Stephen Bipes, Vice President for AdvaMed, Leticia Fonseca, Deputy Secretary and Executive Secretary for Brazil for the Coalition, and myself. In the first part, I will review the schedule for our forthcoming webinars. We will be covering the Coalition objectives, the structure of the Coalition's website, which is being launched later today, how the Coalition has responded to the COVID-19 pandemic, and our vision and mission. Following, Stephen will review the relationships between health, transparency, and trade, and we will be closing this first part with a thorough review of regulatory convergence and regulatory practices definition, good regulatory practices definitions, followed by a Q&A session. During the second part, Leticia will be addressing MedTech-specific regulatory convergence and international benchmarks, where she will be presenting an overview of WHO Global Regulatory Framework for MDs and IVDs, IMDRF documents, and MDSAP, also followed by a Q&A session to conclude with some brief close remarks. Kim, can you help me moving to the next slide, because I think my control panel is not working? Thank you so much. On June 2nd, we will have Janet Trunzo, Senior Vice President, Technology and Regulatory Affairs at AdvaMed and Chair for the Global Medical Technology Association Regulatory Committee, and Renata Amaral, member of the Technical Secretariat of the Coalition, joining us for a GMTA regulatory update and good regulatory practices overview. By June 9, Joe Luling, Vice President of Standards Strategy and Emerging Technologies at the Association for the Advancement of Medical Instrumentation, Renata Amaral, and Jessica Rube, Manager for International Policy at the American National Standards Institute, will be the presenters for WTO Technical Barriers to Trade, International Standards and Conformity Assessment, and closing with medical device standardization. For the last webinar in the series, we are honored to have FDA joining us. Patricia Pineda, International Regulatory Analyst, will introduce the FDA Latin America office and will provide an overview of IMDRF structure, its working groups and priorities, FDA Medical Device Division, CDRH, and LATAM activities. She will also provide an overview of the FDA engagement with IMDRF and use of international standards for medical device regulatory convergence, closing with a review of MDSAP and ISO 13485, followed by a Q&A session. We invite all of you to actively participate with your questions through the chat panel so we may produce a very fruitful learning experience. As a quick reminder, all 4 webinars will be recorded. Slide deck and the recording for each session will be made available through our website, which, as we mentioned before, will be live later today. So with no further ado, let's get started with the topics we have planned for today. I am pretty sure that all of us in here agree that it is critical for the benefit of the population in the Western Hemisphere, as it is for the entire globe, the need to increase availability of life-saving and life-improving medical technologies. The coalition has identified that reducing barriers to patient access, strengthening regulatory efficacy, improving transparency and administrative efficiency, optimizing supply chains, and eliminating barriers to trade are essential elements to reach this goal. Can we get to the next slide, please? Capacity building is a strong foundation among all the stakeholders that have a role in the medtech sector, from industry to government. This is the rationale for the coalition to have developed our website, as it intends to provide sound elements for the construction and continuous development of those capacities. This slide shows our web address and the top section of the landing page of the Regulatory Coalition site, which resides side by side with the Ethics Coalition one. Here, in the next slide, please, we can see a scheme of its structure that allows us to perceive how comprehensive its design is. A key element of the success of a platform like this resides on the continued and updated input to nurture it. We invite all of you, committed members of the coalition, to make sure that our website serves as a platform to broadcast the topics that you consider relevant at your geographical region, which the entire Western Hemisphere will benefit from being aware of. Next slide, please. As COVID-19 pandemic has been the most urgent, relevant, and challenging situation during these past weeks, the coalition has been actively working, among many other activities, with government agencies around the region to help prevent or correct disruption in the supply chain that may negatively impact patients affected by this deadly virus. We have developed several actions to address specific needs that were brought to the attention of the coalition in areas such as IVDs and the challenges of the use of antibody tests, policy recommendations issued by the ABD-IVB, highlighting the relevance and specific needs of our sector in regards to the so much needed regulatory convergence, which was made more evident because of the pandemic. We also produced 2 training sessions with around 300 participants, as well as specific materials to get manufacturing facilities located in the border states of Mexico with the United States, which are an important element to the global supply chain of medical technologies, to be prepared to pass special inspections during the stay-home journey as it impacted the so defined essential activities. The situation is not over yet, so we will continue to support all the members that may require it to successfully get to its end. You may access all these materials in our website later on. We also want to take, and if we can move to the next slide, please, to remind us of our vision and mission, which unite all of us and provide a North Star in this endeavor. As we all can read through, I will only refer to the first sentence in our vision, which makes it for all. One standard, one test accepted everywhere for any medical technology scope. Can we go to the next slide, please? And as for our mission, it is clear that our leadership to coordinate all materially affected stakeholders to achieve our vision is to be exercised by each and every one of the coalition's members. And of course, we rely on you all. Thank you, and let's get into the next part of the presentation with Stephen Vibes. Stephen, please.
Thank you, Sandra. Good morning, everyone. I likewise hope that all are doing well during our respective COVID-19 responses. AdvaMed is pleased to be working with its partner MedTech associations, member companies, and standardization members in the coalition as our primary mechanism to advance regulatory convergence and good regulatory practices in the Americas. So I first extend our thanks to all of you for participating in the coalition and joining us today and for this webinar series. For those of you who don't know me, I work in the Global Department at AdvaMed in Washington, D.C. My geographic responsibilities are the Western Hemisphere, OUS, outside the United States, as well as Africa, but I'm also the topical lead on good regulatory practices, international standards, and technical barriers to trade. The purpose of my presentation today is to provide the overarching map of messages of the webinar series and of the regulatory coalition work. The subsequent presentations of my colleagues will cover each topic in greater detail, as the webinar series is being recorded and will be available on the coalition website later today, as Sandra mentioned. It will also serve as an information resource to guide our coalition work moving forward. And so with that, there are three contexts to the regulatory coalition work: health, trade, and transparency. First, on health. The World Health Organization has a document titled the Model Regulatory Framework for Medical Device and IVD Medical Devices. It is the primary guidance for medical device regulators and contains two key principles: the principle of reliance and the stepwise approach. In the reliance principle, the WHO encourages medical device regulators to use and leverage the regulatory outcomes of other medical device regulators. In the stepwise approach, the WHO encourages medical device regulators to prioritize their activities commensurate with their resources. This means for most regulators, starting with basic controls, import review, post-market surveillance. To put things into context, the FDA Medical Device Division, the Center for Devices and Radiological Health, the CDRH, has approximately 1,800 employees. Most medical device regulatory divisions of the agencies in Latin America have no more than 50 employees, with the average number closer to 10. With 1,800 employees, the FDA says that they do not have sufficient resources to create US unique technical regulations that are not based on international standards. The implicit goal of the FDA Standards and Conformity Assessment Program that the FDA will review in their session is to develop zero technical regulations or standards that are not based on international standards. So part of the work, our work in the coalition, will be to encourage full implementation of this WHO guidance for medical device regulators. There's also a trade context with the World Trade Organization, WTO. The WTO Technical Barriers to Trade Agreement is an international treaty constituting relevant international law. And it requires, as we will review in the webinar series, that its members, which are all of the countries of the Americas as well as the majority of other countries in the world, use international standards as a basis for national regulations. Part of the work in this area of the coalition and its associations and companies, as we mentioned earlier, is preventing barriers to trade from being created and to remove those that currently exist. And there are two major categories of barriers to trade: non-tariff barriers, or NTBs, and tariff barriers. The work of the coalition focuses on the non-tariff barriers, in particular, technical barriers to trade regarding regulatory standards and conformity assessment. And there's a transparency context. And I'm going to read this quote to you. The longer that it takes any government agency to conduct its function, and the more that it deviates from the use of international standards, the higher the perception and margin for unethical conduct. This was an observation of the Colombian Secretary of Transparency at the Andy Medical Device Forum in Bogota in 2018. And it makes the clear connection between the work of ministries of transparency and anti-corruption with the work of the coalition, our association of member companies, on reducing regulatory barriers. Many of us, most of us, focus on either the QA/RA regulatory aspect, reducing, eliminating the barriers between patients and the technologies, reducing the supply chain bottlenecks. But this, of course, assists in other activities and priorities of governments in rule of law, anti-corruption, and improving government and business ethics. We have a partner coalition, the Business Ethics Coalition, that has as its primary focus ethics. However, the regulatory coalition has its function as well in reducing the issues and the regulatory barriers that are often at the source of ethical difficulties. And so within the context of the work in the Americas, the Inter-American Development Bank, as we'll talk about, very much at the core, in addition to removing the supply chain and patient barriers to technologies, is this core function on improving transparency as well. To talk about terminology, I think it's important through the webinar series and the work of the coalition that we are on the same page as far as definitions. Regulatory convergence is a concerted public-private effort to systematically pursue and maximize alignment of sector-specific technical regulations, standards, and conformity assessment criteria to globally harmonized international standards. It's a sector-specific vertical activity. In the context of our sector, medical technology regulatory convergence is a concerted public-private effort to systematically pursue and maximize alignment of medical technologies sector-specific regulation standards and conformity assessment criteria. And I want to differentiate this term, regulatory convergence, from good regulatory practices, GRP. GRP is a formalized, mandatory, whole of government policy that defines the common and transparent rules by which regulatory agencies develop technical regulations for all sectors. That is to say, it is a cross-sectoral mechanism, transverse, horizontal, foundational, and doing so following the international standards for GRP. Another way to think about it is that GRP is the quality control mechanism for the development of regulations, ensuring on a continuous and systematic basis that government rules are relevant, of the highest quality, cost-effective, internationally aligned, and least economically restrictive amongst alternatives of the same purpose. This diagram is meant to portray the relationship between sectoral regulatory convergence and cross-sectoral good regulatory practices. The medical device sector is a sector parallel to others such as pharmaceuticals, cosmetics, chemicals, information and communication technology, telecommunications, transportation, construction, industrial equipment, toys, ad infinitum. And there are efforts, regulatory convergence efforts within each of those verticals to align the regulations and standards for that sector. GRP is not specific to any one sector. It applies to all sectors. It's the mechanism by which the government as a whole conducts its rulemaking in a standardized and predictable way. So the bulk of the coalition activity, I'd say at least 75%, will be focused on the vertical, medical device, but at least 25% will be focused on the transverse, good regulatory practices, for several different reasons. One is that sector-specific regulatory convergence is limited if the foundational good regulatory practice is not in place. We've seen instances of major initiatives of, say, the Inter-American Development Bank supporting a regulatory convergence effort between select sectors of designated countries. But if there's no GRP policy in place in those countries, it's kind of like raking the leaves in your front yard and not binding them up. The wind will blow them away. The ministries change, the authorities change, the governments change, and all of that work to harmonize is lost. So yes, we will spend at least 75% of our work on medical device sector-specific convergence, but we will also dedicate a portion of our time to the cross-sectoral work on GRP. And even though that's cross-sectoral, we as a sector will be demonstrating our leadership in the broader-based coalitions in each country and across the Americas to promote GRP. This matrix is meant to kind of map out the activities. Hopefully my mouse is showing up here, but where the bulk of us have resided and focused our work is in this lower left square here. And just to talk about, map out what we're looking at. This upper row is all of our good regulatory practice cross-sectoral work. And this lower row is all of the regulatory convergence, the sector-specific work. And this first column is the regulatory cooperation, information sharing, capacity building, and training. And the second column is really the trade obligations and enforcement. So in this lower left southwest corner, quadrant 3, this is where most of us, the QARA and the the QARA teams have worked, working with the WHO Model Regulatory Framework, working with the International Medical Device Regulators Forum, working in the context of the Asia-Pacific Economic Cooperation and the Pan American Health Organization, and looking at models like the FDA CDRH Standards and Conformity Assessment Program. And often this work has been with the medical device regulatory authorities, ministries of health, and in specific, the medical device teams. But for the coalition to be successful, and our associations and standardization bodies in industry, and indeed even working with governments, we need to recognize that this work also extends on the trade side. We'll be talking in the webinar series about the specific requirements of the World Trade Organization, Technical Barriers to Trade Agreement. In particular, these 3 articles, where regulations can't be developed to obstruct trade, old regulations need to be removed, and standards need to be used as a basis for national regulations. These provisions of the WTO are also codified in regional and bilateral trade agreements, as we'll talk about. And when we work with the governments on enforcement of these measures, we are often working with the ministries of trade and the foreign ministries on enforcement of the agreement. One area I want to call attention to is that if for the coalition to be successful, we also need to be working with the medical device regulatory authorities, but the regulatory process teams. Often our specialists are dealing with the medical device teams, but in many cases, the medical device teams have no say on how the agency or the division as a whole defines the regulatory process or complies with its international trade obligations. So we need to expand our work, as we have been doing the last few years, more formalized beyond just the medical device teams, but to be working specifically with the regulatory process teams and of course with the trade and foreign ministries. On the horizontal work, the coalition will be working with the Organization for Economic Cooperation and Development, the Asia Pacific Economic Cooperation, the Inter-American Development Bank, and in particular, the cooperation between what are the so-called Central Regulatory Coordination or Oversight bodies. Many countries, and increasingly many countries, are implementing these Central Regulatory Coordination bodies as the quality control mechanism to implement the GRP laws in each country. And these organizations work with these Central Regulatory Coordination bodies on how they conduct their function. AdvaMed, in working in partnership with our medtech associations in the region, have already begun doing this in Colombia and in Mexico, in the other countries. And so this work will continue to ensure that as this becomes a more formalized part of how governments do their rulemaking, the medical technology sector is providing its input. But I note that there's also an enforcement aspect to this as well, and that the articles of the WTO TBT agreement I mentioned earlier are themselves good regulatory practices and that they're legally binding. They're enforced by trade agreements, regional and bilateral. And for those countries such as Colombia that just joined the OECD, or for those countries that wish to accede to the OECD, such as Brazil and Argentina, they will have to implement these things in order to become members of the OECD. So our coalition will work with the medical device regulatory authorities, medical device teams, the regulatory process teams, the foreign and trade ministries, the central regulatory oversight bodies, and the executive office of the presidencies and trade and foreign ministries on the implementation of this 2x2 matrix, which is really the map of our coalition work. And of course, the rest of the webinar series will delve down into the aspects of each of these. What are the key overarching takeaways of the series? 1, the WTO TBT agreement defines a technical regulation as a document with which compliance is mandatory. A standard is a document with which compliance is voluntary. And the best mechanism to harmonize cross-border requirements is for regulators to use harmonized international standards, either directly or as a basis for their national regulations. Standards developing organizations, SDOs, have technical committees that develop the international standards for medical devices. SDOs must be open to all materially affected stakeholders, including regulators, government, healthcare providers. Any materially affected stakeholder must be able to participate in the SDO activity, and every country in the Americas has access to the SDOs. One of the most expensive activities a government can engage in is rulemaking. And this is particularly the case if the rule is ineffective or if it is overly burdensome given the regulatory purpose. Governments have the independence to prioritize their health resources, but the question we ask is, what is the likelihood that an agency working alone will A, identify a new regulatory issue not yet identified elsewhere globally, or B, develop a policy that does not conflict with existing policies globally? So we offer that the guidance of the WHO and the requirements of the WTO are tools that can help the coalition and regulators help complete their mission. Good regulatory practices is the quality control system for a government's regulatory process. In the same way that it would be unthinkable for a medical device manufacturer to not have a QA system or to manufacture a product and send it straight out to its clients and hospitals and clinics without having tested it and having a QA system in place, government should likewise not be issuing regulations into the market without having a QA system and having a checklist for their development and continual review. The WTO TBT agreement is a GRP, and it's also a legally binding international trade obligation. Countries and all of their government agencies and bodies are required to use international standards as a basis for their technical regulations, and not doing so is inconsistent with the WTO TBT agreement. So again, the World Health Organization encourages medical device regulators to use international standards. The WTO requires medical device regulators to use international standards. As Sandra mentioned, this is our website. Currently, it's the home of the Ethics Coalition website. Throughout the day, by midnight tonight, this will be bifurcated. You will see two icons on the page, one for ethics, one for regulatory convergence. And then we encourage you to explore the whole convergence website that Sandra mapped out earlier, and it will be a wealth of information. The coalition is establishing its regulatory priorities and position papers by topic and country, and we hope to have the bulk of that work working with you concluded in July. And just to emphasize, our coalition is dedicated to working with all stakeholders towards one standard, one test, one acceptance, accepted everywhere. And with that, I'll pass it back to you. Thank you.
Thank you, Stephen. And thank you for this thorough review. I think that every single time that we go over these topics, we gain additional knowledge and additional elements that will facilitate our journey towards gaining regulatory convergence throughout the Western Hemisphere. As up to this moment, we have not received any questions through the questions panel that requires any reply from you. However, I have a question, and I really invite all the attendees, if you have any question, let's take advantage of all the experience that Stephen has in this area so we can get clarification on any doubt or any specific concern that we may have, as we are all living so diverse experiences in our specific regions, and specifically in this context of so much uncertainty because of the pandemic. And while we receive any question, mine is in regards of probably some practical thing that at the enterprise is lived kind of like on a daily basis, because at the enterprise level, situation is not that different as compared to government in regards of having various roles, reporting it to different structures that definitely require to be aligned to succeed in reaching regulatory convergence. So in that sense, is there any specific recommendation that you may have to facilitate this process?
Thank you, Sandra, for the question. And advice that we've been giving to the AdvaMed members and that we would share with everyone in the coalition and listening to the webinar is that we would ask each company to kind of do a mapping of how they currently, what's their strategy and tactics for achieving regulatory convergence good regulatory practices, and how do they plan to do that? We know that the QA/RA teams are aware of the issues in each country, but if they have not, and they usually have some type of Excel file or identification of the issues, but it's very helpful to for the work of each association and the work of the coalition, if the companies can forward a brief description of the issue, let's say country X, subject Y, we're having this difficulty. They list either the technical regulation or the standard or the lack thereof or the conformity assessment measure. That's the problem. What the suggested company or association position for the coalition be, and then links to whether it's the Spanish, Portuguese, English versions or translations of the measures. In this way, and the coalition will be helping to assist in gathering this information, and also, of course, mentioning the relevant international standard that should serve as the basis for the technical regulation. We have, I would say, without exception, and working with the medical device regulators, an open door. There really is a desire to achieve regulatory convergence. No one is creating barriers on purpose. It's very often just getting the right information to the right people. And I'd say the ball is in the court. The responsibility is ours on behalf of the private sector to do our homework and to swiftly bring the attention of the regulators to the issues that we identify, with suggestions on how they be resolved, leveraging the relevant international standard. And we can do so in Spanish and English and Portuguese as required. So the coalition will be providing its consensus position and recommendation on how the regulators move forward. And that way, the medical device agencies, the regulatory process people, but also the people in the trade ministries, they can all see what industry has identified as an area needing attention. I would say the activity, at least from my perspective, the last years at AdvaMed has been when a member company will contact us and say, we've got this problem in country X, can you help with it? Well, first begins the detective work of getting all the documents I just mentioned and creating the consensus position. And then we begin the conversations of working with the regulators and working with the trade ministries. And I would say that quote unquote homework, if it's done properly and thoroughly, takes several years. So I think that to the extent that the companies can get that information from the top, we can reduce quite drastically the amount of time it takes to pursue and get the full cooperation of the governments to go after the issues. The other, I would say, is particularly inside our member companies, often which have matrix management structures, is doing at a minimum a mapping of one team to the other to know who deals with which aspect. So clearly the QA/RA teams will know the regulatory issue in the country, but it's helpful, I think, if the QA/RA team knows who leads on trade issues and who leads the company's effort of tracking the notifications of the World Trade Organization. Because as we'll find out in the webinar series, each regulator is required to notify to the global community its mandatory technical regulations. And the world has a 60-day comment period. But the onus is the governments are by and large complying with their obligation to notify, but the onus is on us, the industry, to sign up to get the notifications, to be reviewing those notifications, to be providing comments in what constitutes a global public consultation, and so to the extent that the QA/RA teams can know who in the company is tracking the WTO notifications, who's preparing the comments, who's submitting them, who's working with the ministries of trade as the follow-up, and hopefully that's all being done in a concerted fashion. So that the first request, I would say, that could be very helpful is the member companies and associations tackling that.
Thank you, Stephen. And I'm going to take advantage of me being at the mic now, just to complement the question by asking, is there any, I would say, like best demonstrated practice in regards of any company having shared that, or is this something that is being done on a case-by-case basis? Just trying to understand what has proven to be like the most effective approach.
I'm not going to name any companies, but I would
Yes.
say that those that have tighter integration, or at least links or periodic meetings between the QARA teams and those that do government affairs and track trade agreements and trade enforcement, they're in a better position to systematically leverage the tools to achieve convergence. That's one. In addition, as you know, a common theme of TBT and GRP and convergence is international standards. And international standards tends to be a kind of, maybe it's a forgotten enterprise, or it's an invisible universe, but it's a part of regulatory policy. And some companies have dedicated teams of people, or at least a dedicated person who's the standards executive or standards representative. Yes, they're inside the regulatory team, but they're also a key tool and mechanism for the company to eliminate identified technical barriers to trade. So some companies have this dedicated team, they have this dedicated person, and at a minimum, they have a mapping of which of their, in the case of multinational companies, they're in a position to maintain the map of who is doing what on what standards committee in which country, so that there's a global convergence pushing in the right direction. And I'll give you an example. As we'll find out when we talk about standards development, technical committees, yes, there's the activity of ISO and IEC and other SDOs, but each country has its own national standards body, and the onus is on the companies, industry, as well as regulators to participate in these technical committees. They're open. But sometimes the companies will say, well, you know, it's my regulatory person in another country or headquarters who deals with this. I don't deal with this. So then they don't necessarily participate on the local standards committee. Who then participates on the local committee is those that may not be have interests that are aligned with using international standards. And so the onus is on all companies to be aware, hopefully working on a global basis, working with their partners and active in the local standards committees, and actively proposing that the local standards committee be adopting the international standard that then allows or facilitates the use of the international standard by local industry as well as the local regulators. And I understand that some of these types of structures take time. It's not easy necessarily to get additional headcount on anything, but I think if the companies conduct a cost-benefit analysis, they would find that having a dedicated standards executive that has at least at a minimum a coordination function, it would more than pay for itself, given the goals that all of our companies and associations have for regulatory convergence. And it's something we're asking the regulators to do. When the FDA talks in the fourth session, they'll talk about how they've got their standards and conformity assessment program and a dedicated standards executive. Now, it's not every agency that can have 300 people participating in different standards committees around the world, but even having one is less onerous on the agency in public health resources than trying to create a regulation in isolation. We're asking the governments to have standards executives. We think it's important for the associations and the companies to have standards executives as well that can be a bridge between the QARA teams and the trade teams.
Thank you very much, Stephen. So we have a question that was raised by Natalie Trejos. Her question is, how it will be managed before the governments of the countries that the regulatory convergence agreements reached through the coalition are actually implemented in the countries?
That's a good question. Thank you for that. So the coalition works with each of its members. So each MedTech association logically and appropriately maintains the lead interaction with the local medical device regulator. The coalition provides resources to support the local associations and companies. So once the coalition has reviewed and ratified its priorities and metrics and objectives hopefully in July, coming out of that, we'll have the consolidated hemispheric positions on what I'm just using these as examples, but whether it's UDI or software as a medical device or reuse, whatever the technical topic is, we'll have the consolidated hemispheric position, English, Spanish, and as needed in Portuguese, that the associations can use in their respective conversations with their medical device regulatory agencies and their ministries of trade. And in that way, I think those conversations can really start going at an order of magnitude faster than they have in the past. Because the great difficulty we've had historically is A, getting the information together, but B, as you talk with the trade teams, many trade analysts and specialists and folks in the ministry, they're not really familiar with medical devices per se. They also perhaps don't differentiate it well from other sectors such as pharma. And we can provide these resources, the coalition, that the associations and companies can use that can greatly facilitate productive conversations of the agencies and the trade ministries. And then very quickly it becomes evident where the let's call it the less than full implementation of the TBT agreement or other trade agreements is taking place. Until then, the trade folk are a little reluctant to lean on the medical device specialists because they're not medical device specialists. But if we make it very clear how what is being implemented or what is not being implemented is a violation of the TBT agreement and not consistent with the WHO guidance and not helping patients and health, it really enables them to have that conversation and to achieve full implementation of the WTO and HO requirements and guidelines at the national level.
Thank you very much, Stephen. We have another question that's coming from Sergio Madeira from Brazil. His question is, probably the software registration could be the model of all integration as unregulated everywhere. Can we work on that as a model?
And maybe just as a particular topic, Sandra, do you think? Is that what that's meant?
That is what I am understanding from the question. And if that is the case, and you can complement your question or comments, Sergio, through the same platform. My understanding of the question, I think that we are already addressing that is related to the digitalization of the processes at the agencies level. And that is something that not only came out as as part of the policy recommendations issued by the ABD, but also it is one of the priorities, the overarching priorities that as recent as last week, the Executive Committee for the Coalition has approved to be shared with the members. So if my understanding of the question is correct, that could be this specific topic in regards of electronic submissions.
That sounds right.
Okay. And we have a comment only. It's excellent comments regarding standards and regulations with government affairs. And I think that is definitely kind of like a new language and a new way of living for the regulatory affairs function. This need to a matrix work within the same company. Any comment, Stephen?
Just a final comment. I would say that it's important in our terminology that we use the term regulatory convergence for what it is meant to be, being the vertical, the sector-specific work, and use GRP as the horizontal work. And of course, the agencies, the medical device agencies will work to implement GRP. They will work to implement the cross-sectoral requirements for their sectors within their agencies. But just so that as we educate other parts of government that are not, they can interuse these terms, the more precise we can be, the more it helps the greater cause. And I've heard, for example, in the context of trade agreements being negotiated, what sectors are being contemplated in the GRP chapter? And I'm busily commenting in the chat box that GRP has nothing to do with any individual sector. A GRP chapter of a trade agreement is on all of the horizontal requirements and only on the horizontal requirements, so that the government as a whole is doing its rulemaking in a predictable and consistent fashion. Later on in trade agreements, you can have sector-specific annexes that get into particularities of individual sectors, including medical devices, but a GRP chapter is cross-sectoral. It's important to use that terminology, regulatory convergence, as medical device specific, and GRP is cross-sectoral.
Thank you very much for pointing this out. I think this is really very helpful information. And with this, we have already responded to the questions that we received for this section of our webinar. So we'll be transferring them to Leticia. Please go ahead.
Thank you very much, Sandra. Good morning. My name is Leticia Fonseca, and I'm going to, I'm going to present some international benchmarkers used as a reference to regulatory convergence in the medtech sector. We are going to talk about the WHO model regulatory framework for medical devices and IVD medical devices, the IMDRF documents, including N47 and N51, and the medical device single out. Probably you have heard about this before, but for us it's very important to align some information with all. In 2014, the World Health Assembly adopted a resolution regarding regulatory system strengthening for medical products. The resolution states that effective regulatory systems are an essential component of health systems strengthening and contribute to better health outcomes. In this spirit, the WHO decided to develop the WHO model regulatory framework for medical devices and IVD medical devices. This document contains guidelines that are intended to provide guidance and support for the development and implementation for improvement of regulatory controls of medical devices. The model suggests a progressive or stepwise approach to implement and enforcing regulatory controls for medical devices as regulation progress from a basic level to expanded one. It considers that resources like people, funds, technology, and facility in many countries are limited, bringing the need for a phased approach. The model does not offer detailed guidance on regulatory issues, but contains reference to relevant documents where additional information can be found. The model recommends guidance principles, harmonize definitions, and specify the attributes of an effective regulations. Some important elements in medical devices are definition, the Global Harmonization Task Force document, namely definition of terms medical device and in vitro medical device, published in 2012, contains the definition terms for these two terms, medical device and IVD medical device, and remains current until now. Recently, two different documents was published by IMDRF Forum, one of them Principles of Labeling for Medical Device and IVD Medical Devices, and Essential Principles for Safety, and Essential Principles for Safety and Performance of Medical Devices and IVD Medical Devices. Oh, I can, yes, Tina. Another important point is the classification. We have more than 2 million different types of medical devices circulating on the world market. The control of these products can be a challenge because they vary in their diversity and complexity. The controls imposed and the resources allocated and imposed controls proportional to the potential for harm associated with medical devices. Classification is made applying some rules, a set of classification rules. The most recently classification rules published was the Regulation 745 from 2017 from the European Union. These regulations took as a base one GFPF document. Another one rules are in public consultation now. The IMDRF proposed document, Principles of In Vitro Diagnosis, Medical Device Classification, closed at the end of July 25. We put this public consultation in the website from the Commission. You can see later if you want. Other important points addressed are the essential principles. Sorry. Products should be safe and perform as intended when placed on the market. Manufacturers must be able to demonstrate to the regulatory authorities that their product complies with essential principles and has been designed and manufactured to be safe and perform as intended during its lifetime when used according to the manufacturer's safety intended purpose. We are going to take more about this later. And we are going to talking about assessing conformity. Usually, the products are classified in 4 different classes. We can see here the class for A, B, C, and D. From the low risk to the high risk, and different conformity assessments procedures are applied. The table shows an example that the evidences like quality management system, the technical documentation, and declaration of conformity to demonstrate the conformity of product. For low risk, we have less controls applicable, and for high risk, class B, we have more. Yes. Another important concept highlight is reliance. Reliance is when assessment performed by another regulatory authority or other trusted institution is used by one regulatory authority with significant weight in its decision-making process. The regulatory authority receives the information, analyzes the information, and decides based on this information. It's different from the concept of recognition. In recognition process, the regulatory authority accepts and use the information and the regulatory decision for another regulatory authority or trusted institution. The model proposes a stepwise approach from the basic level to the standard level. This table shows examples of basic levels applicable during the pre-market, placing on the market, and post-market activity. And the next one talks about the standard controls. We are going to talk more about recognized standards. This point is very important for us. Recognizing standards. Preference is conformity with voluntary standards is a mean by which the manufacturer may demonstrate that a medical device conforms to one or more of the essential principles of safety and performance consistently through its life cycle. It's important that preference for recognition should be given to international standards like ISO, IAC, regional standards, and national versions of international standards. It's important too that national standards correspond to the current versions of international standards. Adoption of recognized systems of recognized standards is also very important. We will explore a little bit more about the use of standards through these two different documents, Essential Principles of Safety and Performance Medical Devices and Optimizing Standards for Regulatory Use. Essential Principles of Safety and Performance of Medical Devices and IVD medical devices. The worldwide adoption of a common set of fundamental design and manufacturing requirements for medical devices that, when met, provide assurance the device is safe and performing as intended, offers significant benefits to, among others, manufacturers, users, patients, consumers, and to regulatory authorities. The use of standards can streamline the device review process, improve the efficiency of regulations, and lower costs to regulatory compliance. These standards applies to all medical devices and IVD medical devices, and identify and describe essential principles of safety and performance, which should be considered during the design and manufacturing process. When some of the essential principles of safety do not apply, justification should be provided. This list shows essential principles applicable to all medical devices and IVD medical devices, some additional requirements applicable only to medical devices, and additional requirements applicable only to IVD medical devices. Sorry. These are the table provided by the document Essential Principles, shows the relationship between essential principles, guidances, and standards, relevant standards applicable. We can tell about the second item, 5.2. This item is related with clinical evaluations. We can see the guidance related with clinical evaluation and the relevant standard applicable in this case. Some other points explored in the document are the importance of use of consensus standards, the voluntary use, and alternative ways to demonstrate that they met essential principles. To finish this topic, we are going to talk about optimizing standards for regulatory use. This document is directed to regulatory standards, regulatory authority, standard development organizations, and who wants to participate in standard development process. Serve as an educational tool and research by proposing improvements in the standards writing process. The background, considering the development of this document, took into account the benefits of using standards, the way of how standards are frequently written, and their utility in regulatory process, and the difficulties faced by regulatory authorities to participate in ISO and IRC committees, like research, sometimes related with people, with the costs of the participation. The IMDRF encourages the use of appropriate consensus standards in regulatory regimes and recommend that all regulatory authorities assess standards and publish a list or recognize or approved standard. Publish a list of recognized or approved standards means transparency and predictability. It's very important. Some countries use standards, but they didn't have a list of recognized standards. And expectations of the development optimized standards are a commitment to IMDF essential principles, an emphasis on performance over design stipulations in writing standards, and the importance of consensus approach. These are the attributes to be considered for development of standards for regulatory process. We can see the states of the art, consensus, efficiency, reproducibility, consistency, clarity, non-duplication, accessibility, fairness, and compatibility. Finally, the document explores how enhancing the stakeholders' participations, providing information about international, regional, and national level participation, and recommendations for participations. One important tool to learn more about standards is the CDRH Learn. This training is available in the FDA website. In this link here, you can access the training by this link. And to finish, we are going to talk about the medical device single audit program. And what is medical device single audit program? The medical device single audit program allows an MDSAP recognized audit organization to conduct a single audit of medical device manufacturers that satisfy the relevant requirements of the regulatory authority participating in the program. The program was developed to have appropriate regulatory oversight, minimizing regulatory burden on the industry, promote more efficient and flexible use of regulatory research, promote global alignment of regulatory approaches and technical requirements based on international standards and best practices. The members are Australia, Brazil, Canada, Japan, and US. The pre-qualification program of in vitro diagnostics from the WHO is an observer, and the European Union too. And last year was created a new category, the affiliate members, and Matt from Argentina is an affiliate member, and South Korea. The management of the MDSAP program is made by the Medical Device Regulatory Single Audit Program Regulatory Authority Council, with representatives from all participant regulatory authorities that provides direction, oversight, and research to support the program, like development, implementation, maintenance, or expansion. Like I said before, the medical device single audit program affiliated member is a non-participant in the SAP observer or a non-participant in the SAP regulatory authority that wants to engage in the program, demonstrate understanding of the program, and utilize MDSAP audit reports or MDSAP certificate for evaluation of medical device manufacturers' quality management system. To become an affiliate member, the regulatory authority have to follow some steps. First of all, they have to submit an application form declaring their intent to participate in the program. Then, after this, they have to submit some online training. And every year, they have to report the utilization of the MDSAP reports or MDSAP certificates. And they, being an affiliate member, they have access to weekly status reports that will contain information on manufacturing site, audit dates, and recognize audit organization. An affiliate member can obtain information related with MDSAP report or MDSAP certificate asking the manufacturer. They don't have access in the base, in the report from the base of the medical device single audit program. They have to ask to the manufacturer. The audit made by an organization, the organization will code the requirements from the ISO 30485 from 2016 and additional requirements from Australia, Brazil, Canada, Japan, US, and sometimes some specific requirements of medical device regulatory authority that participate in the program. And the final point is related with the exchange of information. Regulatory exchange platform. This platform was developed by the PAHO and allows to exchange non-public regulatory information. There are two different models. The model MDSAP that supports the activities from MDSAP program, and the model RISE that authorities that adhere to reps through a memorandum of sense can change information between there and PAHO. With this, I'm finished my presentation. Thank you. Sandra?
Thank you very much, Leticia. I think that you had shared with the audience a very comprehensive analysis of the international standards and how they can be used as a day-to-day tool on the activities that as regulatory professionals we are running within the challenging environments that are very diverse throughout the region. We have not received any questions yet through the panel, so we invite all the attendees to the webinar to post them so we can take advantage of having Leticia here with us. As most of you probably know, Leticia has a really strong wealth of experience in the IVD sector as she was part of ANVISA for many years in that specific area. So taking advantage of Leticia being here could probably be very helpful to address some questions that our audience may have. We have here one question that is coming from Veronica Giorlando. Her question is how an affiliate member of MDSAP can be included as a final member.
To be an affiliate member is the first step. I think they are discussing now. There are no. First, they have to prove how they are using the report for a long time. I'm not sure if they are considering the entry of another affiliate members in the like members, because they have to update all the requirements applicable. As I showed, as I showed in one slide, the audit is considered the ISO 3045 and the requirements applicable to all members, and to be a member, probably they have to update these requirements, and I'm not sure if they are thinking this right now. Is it clear, Veronica?
Yes, I think it was. And it's interesting how through different aspects, governments are starting to be more and more interested on MDSAP, and I think that is certainly going to continue to increase in the future. Just to give you an example, in the case of Mexico, under the new trade agreement between Canada, the US, and Mexico, one of the chapters, I mean, the one related to medical devices, is requiring for Mexico to accept MDSAP certificates, and for Mexico to apply MDSAP requirements while issuing good manufacturing practices certificates. So it is through a trade agreement that we are having a positive impact in this case for the way our authorities are granting these certificates, and for sure that will have a positive impact not only in regards of time frames to get those certificates, but also in the cost associated with having to comply with specific requirements at a country level that are not aligned at an international level. I don't see any additional question in the questions panel, so I'd like then to go to the closing remarks, and we really want to thank all the participants to this webinar. We reached at the top of the webinar 100 participants, which we consider it a great success, and for sure the benefit of the content that was discussed in here can be expanded through the recording that is going to be published at the website of the coalition. So on behalf of the Technical Secretariat, we want to thank each and every one of you for being here today. As we mentioned, by the end of the day today, the website will go live and you will receive an email with the web address so you can start exploring and benefit from its content. During today's session, it has been highlighted the role of the coalition in supporting its members to navigate through challenging situations, the importance of including the regulatory process, the framework established at a country level by the good regulatory practices as a means to ensure regulatory convergence for the medical technology sector is achieved, and that, of course, it requires a multidisciplinary approach at the enterprise level. It was also addressed the need for the regulatory affairs professionals to strengthen competencies regarding relevant international standards and the need for an active participation in the local committees to promote their utilization in the development of new regulations at a country level, and of course to prevent local specific non-aligned ones, as we recognize that they limit the access to medical technology to improve and save patients' lives. So thanks again, have a great day, and look forward to meet you all again in the next session that we're going to be holding next Tuesday. Thank you very much and have a great rest of the day.
Thank you, Sandra, and thank you everyone for joining today's webinar, and thank you to all of our panelists as well. As a reminder, today's webinar recording and slides will be available to attendees within 24 hours at www.interamericancoalition.med-medtech.org. Please refer to the calendar invitations sent by my colleague Erin Leahy at eleahy@advamed.org to register for the additional webinars within this series, or reference any additional communications sent by Sandra or Stephen Bipes. Please also visit advamed.org/events for information on additional virtual educational offerings. Should you have any questions, comments, or feedback, we encourage you to contact us at webinar@advamed.org. Thank you again. This concludes today's presentation.